Hello, this is James Barkell and you are listening to the Coach Doctor podcast. On this week's episode, I talk with Gina Haddad. Gina is an expert and published academic in the area of sports leadership and has worked with and researched leadership groups in many team sports. She has studied leadership groups within Super Rugby, NRL, AFL, football and International Rugby Union, and has previously also held positions as a high-performance consultant and education manager with Equestrian Australia. She's a lecturer at the University of Sydney, and more recently she's also joined the Coach Doctor team as our leadership and culture facilitator. One of the main takeaways from this interview is the importance of athlete leadership being a role that is authentic. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Gina. Hi Gina, thanks for joining us on the podcast today. I hope you've been well, and how are you getting on in COVID at the moment?
Hi, James. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I guess so far we've been fairly fortunate down here on the South Coast where I'm living. So, at this present time, we don't have any cases down here. And although we're in lockdown, we sort of live rurally, so we're probably privileged to some extent to be able to get outside a little bit more on the property than some of our colleagues in the Sydney area.
Yeah, nice. That sounds good then. Gina, just asking if you want to give me a bit of a background into your involvement with sport, especially the sport of equestrian, which I know you've been a big part of.
Yeah, sure. So I'm not sure how familiar your listeners might be with equestrian sport. My background was mainly in the discipline of three-day eventing. So I guess for those listeners who were following the Olympics, you might have seen the Australian eventing team won a silver medal at Tokyo, and possibly the most high-profile athlete that your listeners might be familiar with in that space is Andrew Hoy. So that's the sport that I spent most of my earlier life in as an athlete and then as a coach. And I suppose as I was sort of getting on in that coaching journey, I was sort of a level 3 coach, and started to get, I suppose, curious about wanting to learn more about what other sports were doing in that coaching space, and to sort of move out of that silo of my own sport. And I was looking for an opportunity to explore what other coaches did, how other sports did things. And I've done it. I've been fortunate to have a little bit of exposure to some programs through the AIS, and that probably just fueled that curiosity to engage in a sort of cross-pollination way with other sports. And I became aware of the master's program at the University of Sydney. So I sort of went down that path and decided to do my master's in sports coaching at Sydney Uni. So I think I enrolled there in around 2011. And I suppose that 2 years for me was just a fantastic opportunity and a real eye-opener to be able to sort of share ideas and collaborate and learn from some really incredible coaches across a really wide range of sports. And that's probably led me to the research that I've been doing for the last few years now.
Okay, great. For our listeners, give me a bit of a background on leadership in sport and what athlete leadership groups are specifically.
So traditionally in team sports, particularly in sort of the football codes that we've been looking at, the leadership structures have tended to follow that sort of traditional hierarchical model, what we call like vertical leadership, where you have the coach who sits above the team, and most of the influence is in that downward direction from the coach to the players. And despite the appointment of captains and vice captains, historically most of that leadership influence and responsibility has sat with the coach. And I suppose if we think about in a professional sport context, what sort of one of the key purposes of leadership in that environment is, most people would probably agree that it's about trying to create an environment, a team environment that's going to foster, the development of expertise and a really genuine high performance environment, and an environment in which individuals are going to be highly motivated to, basically persist over, a long period of time towards achieving expertise, and that they're going to be motivated to put in high levels of effort towards achieving that level of expertise, and to sort of have that resilience to bounce back, in face of the inevitable setbacks and injuries that they're going to, incur along that journey. And whilst historically the role of sort of creating that environment and motivating athletes in that way has been seen as the, purview of the coach, in recent years we've seen this shift away from that sort of more paternal, more hierarchical leadership structure towards more of a shared leadership approach, or what's sometimes referred to as a decentralized leadership approach. And the one that seems to have gained the most popularity in professional sports teams, certainly in Australia and New Zealand, has been leadership groups. And so what we're sort of seeing with those leadership groups is where we have a core group of players, and it's typically sort of, 5 to 7 players. It varies a little bit from team to team, either side of that. And often includes the captain, co-captains, vice captains. There's all different structures within that group. And those athlete leaders actually serve as sort of a leadership coalition or a leadership collective, and they share elements of the team leadership with the coach. And so rather than it being just this sort of one-way influence, which was predominantly, from the coach downwards to the players, we start to see this multifaceted sort of influence. So we have influence across the team from those athlete leaders and within the leadership group itself, and also that upwards influence as well, where the leadership group is actually providing input into decisions and acting as a voice for the playing group back to the coach. And this sort of leadership model has almost, I think it's safe to say, become the norm, certainly in professional teams in the region.
Are athlete leadership groups growing because it's a fashionable thing for coaches to do, or is it something else to it? I guess in terms of those professional teams you talked about, they've got the time to put into leadership, but for a club team, just a local club team playing in a local competition, suddenly, all of a sudden, they've incorporated leadership groups. Is it just because it's a fashionable thing, or do you think there's a lot of coaches who are actually really looking into the benefits?
That's a really good question, James, a very astute question. So I think it varies from coach to coach, and even at the professional level, there is sort of an element of that mimicking, or that sort of trying to emulate what another coach is doing, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I guess, as we know, with a lot of coaching practice, coaches learn from other coaches and from trying to sort of copy or emulate what seems to be a really successful practice that another coach might be using. So certainly the popularity or the profile of teams like the All Blacks, for example, and some of the hype and the legend that surrounds that leadership group model, and books like Legacy and things like that, and even the model that Sydney Swans use, which is quite well known. We do see coaches at levels below the professional level who are sort of seeking to copy those and emulate those leadership groups. So there's definitely an element about it being trendy, if you want to look at it that way. There are coaches who are, I guess, seeking, to really understand more of the nuance of it, and trying to look into, what is it about empowering players in this way that can bring benefits to teams and to team culture and to team performance and to, individual players' enjoyment and satisfaction within the sport environment. So I think the understanding of the motivational and the sort of psychological benefits of it is growing. But definitely we're still seeing a lot of coaches that are trying to adopt it because they think it's something that maybe maybe they should do. And at times there's this cultural expectation too. We did have some of the coaches in the study that were from Europe and other countries that have moved to Australia and taken up coaching posts here. And some of them did say that they sort of felt there was a cultural expectation that this was something that was sort of, the norm in Australian teams, and that they should therefore be adhering to that norm, even though it was something that maybe they weren't that familiar with, and at times not even very comfortable with. So, and I guess the other element that is emerging is particularly with our Generation Z or our Gen Z athletes, the expectations of athletes are changing. And I think we probably see it in all contexts, in the workplace and in the classroom as well. They have an expectation, I think, that they will have more input and more autonomy and more of a voice. And so the sort of more traditional, more paternal or autocratic almost model of coaching really just doesn't tend to cut it anymore. And so I think coaches are recognising that, and they're looking for, alternative models to really start to engage their athletes, and starting to understand that at all levels, as long as it's, appropriate, athletes are wanting to be able to shape and influence their environment and have some say over what their sport experience looks like.
Okay, thanks. That sounds really interesting. Just in terms of your research, what sports have you studied in terms of leadership groups? Has it just been the football codes, or what sorts of codes have you looked at?
Yeah, so James, at the moment we've focused on sort of the four main professional football codes. So we've worked with the AFL, the Super Rugby, the A-League and the NRL. And so we've had a sample of 30, I think at last count, it might be slightly more than that now, head coaches and athlete leaders from those professional codes. So it's been a really high level sample and a really good cross section across the different football codes. And we have noticed some differences obviously between the codes in terms of their use of athlete leadership groups. There sort of seems to be an evolution it's more mature in some sports than in others. So I think it's safe to say that the AFL is probably more experienced and has been, sort of using this model and exploring it a lot longer. So it's more evolved and tends to be more mature in that space. Some of the other codes, it varies between teams. Some of the other codes are sort of growing and actually exploring it more as time goes on.
What are some of the issues or challenges for coaches setting up leadership groups? If I'm going to set one up with my club rugby team next week, what's some of the issues or the challenges for me as a coach?
So I guess probably the big picture things that coaches tend to grapple with, first of all, is if they're looking to go to a leadership group model, first of all they need to really decide what aspects of the leadership are they comfortable with delegating. So what responsibilities do they want the leadership group to have? So what level of sort of decision-making authority, for want of another word, how much and to what extent will they be involved in team leadership, and what kinds of components of the team leadership will they be involved in? So it is important that you sort of spend some time really thinking about and sort of framing what those responsibilities look like and where the guidelines or the parameters are in terms of where does the coach's leadership sort of, where's the line in the sand. So whilst there'll be hopefully a lot of collaboration, no doubt there will be situations where either due to the nature of the decision or the time pressure, where it may not be feasible or appropriate for there to be sort of a collaboration around that decision. So there needs to be that understanding, that mutual understanding, that at times the coach will have the final say and that will be a coach's decision. there also needs to be some clarity around what elements of the decision making will the leadership group have a say in, and what elements might they actually have complete ownership over. So working out what the scope of those responsibilities look like and where the delimitation is a really important piece. And then I guess the next question is they need to think about who their athlete leaders are going to be. So who's going to be in that leadership group? Getting the right people in the leadership group is really critical to whether it's going to be effective or not. And not only whether it will be effective, but potentially getting the wrong people in that group can be quite detrimental to elements of your team's culture and performance. So they need to think about who they're going to select, but it's not just who. There also needs to be a lot of thought put into how they're going to do that selection process. Because the research sort of is quite strong about the way that we select those athlete leaders, and I'm referring there to whether they're just appointed by the coach or whether the team themselves have some say in that. That has a big bearing on how well the team will actually embrace those athlete leaders and how receptive they're going to be to leadership from their teammates or from their peers. And it also has a big bearing on just how legitimate those athlete leaders feel about their leadership. So it impacts their confidence to lead as well. So it's really important that we get that selection piece right. And so I guess there's some of the key considerations. And it's also really looking at the readiness of your group or the preparedness of your group for this model. And that's probably not as simple as just looking at it in terms of maturity. It's also things like how long the group have been together, how well the individuals within the group know one another, what kind of skills and leadership attributes and capacity the individual team members have in terms of potential leadership skills. Also, what sort of climate there is within the team. Is there a high level of trust? Are there strong relationships within the team? Are there, existing factions or dynamics within the team which may not facilitate a shared leadership structure? So you really need to know the group dynamics quite well and have quite a nuanced understanding of the individuals within the group and how they interact with one another before you sort of embark on this.
Okay, just going back a little bit, when you're selecting the leaders, is there any research that suggests having the team selecting the leaders or the coach selecting the leaders is a better method, or is it dependent on each situation is completely different?
Again, that's a really, really good question. So I think from the players' viewpoint, or certainly the players that we have interviewed, the players were really emphatic that they preferred to have almost complete autonomy and complete transparency over selecting their leaders. So that came through really strongly. They wanted to be able to choose who they wanted to represent them. And so some teams did engage in a team vote where the team would actually vote for the leaders. And some really interesting findings came out in relation to that. So in relation to the vote, the players wanted the vote to be completely transparent. They wanted to know which team members voted for which other team members. So they needed to feel that there'd been no interference or manipulation of those votes by the coaching staff or management, so that the leaders they ended up with were genuinely representative of who they had voted for. Now, there's a lot of research to suggest that when we enable a team to select their own leaders like that, they will be, as I mentioned before, the team will embrace that leadership and it will be genuinely a lot more powerful. However, that approach is not without some issues. And some of the things that, have been flagged in our research were that coaches felt that, and players as well acknowledged this, if there wasn't sufficient preparation done beforehand prior to the vote, you could end up with where players were just voting for their friends, or they were voting, ended up being a popularity vote, or even in some of the teams, votes might take place, early in the season before the group has really got to know one another very well. It might be, there's always new members coming into the team. So they might end up voting based on reputation rather than actually really knowing who is the best leader. And so what came through sort of strongly was that you need to really establish what the team's values are first. So there needs to be a sort of a whole foundational piece prior to getting to the selection of the athlete leaders. There needs to be a lot of work done on establishing a team culture. And within that, what are the core values that the team believes they stand for? So some people might refer to them as, the team trademarks, but there needs to be this process where the entire team actually engage and with, some quite skilled facilitation, they arrive at a place where they've agreed on a set of values that they believe encapsulate what they want to stand for. And then underneath those values, they then unpack what behaviours actually reflect those values. So say, for example, if one of the values that a team believes they want to stand for is honesty. So it would then be a big group discussion, facilitated discussion around, so what does honesty look like in our day-to-day environment, and really clear, explicit examples of, what does that mean and what sort of behaviours actually demonstrate honesty and what behaviours don't demonstrate honesty. And it's really working through that process. And then once they've got the very clear team values and a very strong shared understanding of what the behaviours are that the team believes are acceptable and not acceptable, once that is in place and you have that mutual understanding, then it's about selecting the leaders in accordance with those values. So it's making it really clear that if you're going to go down the path of a team vote and you're going to let the team choose their own leaders, they need a framework, and a very clear framework against which to make that selection. So they need to understand that they're voting for the players that they believe best represent the values and behaviours that the team has come up with, as opposed to, just voting for their mate or the person who they like to, maybe go and have a beer with on Saturday night at the pub. So that piece is really critical to, ensuring that you're going to end up with leaders that embody the team values and are representative of those team values. So where we found that teams were reporting they got into trouble was embarking on a team vote without having done that preliminary work, and then ending up with a leadership group that didn't necessarily represent the team values. And the coach is then in a really difficult position, because if you've given the team the option to choose their own leadership group and you're then not happy with the result and you try to manipulate that result, then it becomes, you've sort of undermined the authenticity of it from the get-go, and it's more than likely doomed to fail.
And that can really affect, I guess, the culture of the group.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of work to be done. I think that was one of the key messages. It takes a lot of preparation and a lot of work before you even get to the point where you might think about selecting the leaders. The cultural piece and that foundation of that culture and embedding that culture, you need that platform before you start to embark on the selection of your leadership group.
Okay. That leads me, I guess, to the next question. So what are some of the strategies that can make these leadership groups work really well, or make sure teams realise the benefits?
So I guess the one that we just really unpacked there about having those player-owned team values, that's really, really important, is establishing those values, but they need to be owned by everyone in the group. So again, the process of developing the values is really important. So it's not about the coach imposing the values on the team. They need to be developed bottom up. So they need, with facilitation, the team needs to come up with those values. So they need to feel that they really genuinely represent what they want to stand for, and they need to have that sense of ownership over those values if it's really going to work. And it is really important that they're linked to accountability. And what we mean by that is, when we talked about that behavioural sort of framework, so if we have the values sitting like an umbrella at the top, and then underneath that umbrella, we're drilling down into each value to see, what are the representative behaviours of that value. That behavioural sort of piece forms a framework within which the athlete leaders or the player leaders can hold their teammates accountable. And what I mean by that is, you might have values that are around honesty or around effort or commitment or professionalism. They're sort of some of the words that people might use. And you might have behaviours that represent those. So for example, we want to keep embedding those values so that the athlete leaders, if they see an example where a teammate is demonstrating a behaviour that is in line with the team values, they will positively reinforce that. But likewise, if they see a teammate whose behaviour is not in line with those values, they will hold them to account to that. It might be a question. It's in a supportive but a challenging way, constantly challenging the behaviour of teammates to be in line with those values. And so that process, that sort of circular process, continues to embed those values more and more. But it also gives the athlete leaders a framework where they've got some guidelines when it comes to their leadership. That's almost like the parameters for their leadership to help them hold their teammates accountable. It also helps for the coach as well. Coaches can be a little nervous about delegating parts of the leadership of the team to players or to athletes when ultimately they're the one that's going to be held accountable for the team's performance. So having that behavioural sort of framework or those behavioural standards, the coach feels that there is some guidelines in which the athlete leaders can operate, and they therefore tend to feel a little more comfortable about delegating. So that piece is very important, making sure you've got those team values that are owned by everyone on the team and that are clearly linked to accountability. And then, as I explained before, the second part is then having those player-driven selection processes that are based on those values. So it's really important that the selection of the athlete leaders is player-driven. There can be, sort of coach input into that. Some of the teams reported that they thought it worked best when the coaching staff and the players, they sat together and there was an external facilitator who came in and managed those sessions. That way, there was no perception that the coaches were trying to influence the selection process, and they were actually sort of on the same level as the playing group, and everyone had a say. And so that tended to be quite powerful. I guess just one other thing when we talk about selecting athlete leaders, it was really important to the group that the leadership group was seen to be like genuinely representative of the whole playing group. So in terms of diversity, whether that was sort of, age, tenure in the team, cultural backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, it was very important that you had a cross-section within the leadership group that was truly representative of everybody, because sometimes when you empower a leadership group within a team, if you don't go about it in a way that's seen to be inclusive, some of the team can feel sort of disconnected or disenfranchised from the rest of the team. So it does need to represent everybody. I guess the other important message was that when it comes to empowering the leaders, the athlete leadership group, that empowerment needs to be authentic and it needs to be appropriate. Players were, pretty quick to pick up if a coach was just going through the motions, sort of, let's have a leadership group, we'll nominate a group of players, we'll appoint them as leaders, But then their actual empowerment was tokenistic. They didn't really have any input. So, for example, leadership groups would report, going to the coach with concerns from the team, raising, concerns on behalf of the team, or taking ideas to the coach, and just being sort of dismissed in an offhand way. And if they felt that their input wasn't valued or was ignored, or they didn't really have any real say in things, and it was just a token thing, they tended to really disengage from that shared leadership process pretty quickly. And they also lost their credibility with the rest of the team. So the team needs to see, it's very important that the team sees that their leadership group that they have chosen to represent them actually has some real influence and can, to some extent shape certain decisions and the way things are done in the team. So the authenticity is really, really important there. Coaches need to understand at the outset, how much am I prepared to share, and be very clear with that from the beginning. And if there is a time where, a coach feels that they may have had input from the players, but they, have weighed all of that up and they need to make a decision that is, goes in a different direction, it's really important that they explain that rationale to the players, so that there is that sort of perception that their input's not valued. And it's important that the extent to which they empower the athlete leaders is appropriate, to the level of the skills and where those players are at. So, it needs to be progressive. If they're a young, inexperienced group, you might start by giving them smaller responsibilities and then gradually increasing those leadership responsibilities as they grow and become more confident and more capable. Another thing I think that we learned is just how much these leadership groups depend on the strength of the relationships within the team. And that's not just the relationships between the players, that's the relationships between the players and the coach as well. So there needs to be really high levels of trust, because one of the core parts of this shared leadership sort of approach with these leadership groups is quite robust feedback between players, so between teammates, but also between players and back upwards, that between the leadership group upwards to the coach. So there needs to be the trust there to support that level of honesty and that feedback. And so we need to really focus on building those strong team relationships. And that comes back to what you said, James, earlier about the team culture. So really investing in those team building sort of initiatives and creating those strong relationships. And some teams have, accelerated that using sort of activities around vulnerability and things like that to try to fast track some of those relationships, but really focusing on that relational element is really important. And I suppose finally, and this underpins all of those other strategies, is that it does tend to need a really high level of facilitation from the very beginning, when you're trying to establish the culture and the team values, the trademarks, the behaviours, through the selection process, supporting those athlete leaders as on their journey, and developing them in the skills that they need to fulfil that role, requires the support of quite a skilled facilitator and some ongoing leadership development support. So some of the messages we got from coaches was, they often embarked on this on their own and quite quickly realised that they maybe didn't have the time or the resources, or in some cases the expertise to really bring it to fruition. So you really need to, I guess, do a little bit of an assessment before embarking on this path as to how much work is involved to set it up, and do you have the time as well as a coach? Most coaches are time poor, and it can't just be kind of an add-on. If it is really going to work and if the team's going to reap the benefits of it, it does need to be sort of central to everything that the team is doing. And so it takes quite a lot of commitment and quite a big investment.
Yeah, it seems to me that in some instances, that some coaches or for some teams, it might be more of a tokenistic thing that they start off at the beginning of the year. They talk about their leadership group and all the things they're going to do. And like you said, it lacks authenticity. And, once the season sort of starts, all of those things have sort of forgotten, and they're just in day-to-day mode where they've gone back to just the normal coach-led training, and there's very little involvement from the leadership group, or very little, I guess, direction around the values or the core values that the team has set in place with the leadership group, I guess, encouraging the other players within that to live up to those values or those behaviours.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that, the athlete leaders that we interviewed reinforced to us. They shared examples of where they would, go through this process, as you said, in the pre-season, and, put some words up on the wall, and then they'd be forgotten about, and no one would sort of even reference them going forward. And that tended to make the players understandably become quite cynical about the whole process. Some of the players who had, been through that process multiple times, really thought that it had been sort of, a wasted opportunity. On the other hand, in teams where they really did walk the walk, and that was sort of led by the mindset of the coach predominantly. So, if the coach really genuinely embraced an athlete empowerment sort of philosophy, they would look every day for opportunities to support their athlete leaders to step into a leadership position. And it might be as something as simple as, presenting a small component of the game review on Monday morning. It might have been a short team meeting before a game. It might have been, delivering some feedback to a fellow player. It might have been running a meeting, all different sort of scenarios. But those coaches were very intentional in constantly saying to themselves, is this something I can hand over? Is this an opportunity for someone else to lead and grow? And that required a lot of planning and a lot of thought and a lot of support, because to ensure that obviously they're in a performance environment, and so to ensure that it was delivered to the standard that it needed to be, they couldn't just throw it to the athlete leaders, certainly not in the early days, and just leave them to figure it out for themselves. It needed to be, carefully planned and supported. So again, there's sort of that element of the extra work, if you like, but they were highly deliberate and intentional in trying to provide those opportunities to really help those players have opportunities to, lead a drill in training, or to have a chance to step up and present to the group and grow their confidence and their leadership skills.
I guess one of the topics in your research is focused on leadership development opportunities for the athletes involved. Tell me a bit about this and how the athletes tend to learn leadership skills.
Yeah, so that's really, really interesting. So I think, there's a mindset that, like, not just in sport, but I think possibly to some extent, in business as well, that leadership is sort of learnt on the job. And that is true. And we found that in our research. It's not quite as simple as just learning through experience, though. There's I can't think who the quote is from, but a really powerful quote about having the experience but missing the learning. And so I think what came through in our research was experiential learning, or that, learning on the job was definitely a big part of how athlete leaders learnt the skills that they needed. But the experiential learning needed to be intentional, and it needed to be facilitated, supported. There needed to be sort of those debriefing components attached to it. It tended not to work so well if it was just ad hoc and left to chance. So there really needed to be that the structure around the experiential learning. And so I suppose to clarify that, that might be things like teams would engage in things such as, doing 360 feedback surveys on their player leaders, on their athlete leaders. So what I mean by that was, their teammates, support staff, coaching staff, and everyone around them would provide feedback on their leadership. And then the leadership facilitator, for example, would sit down with that athlete leader and really unpack that feedback and help that athlete leader to identify what were the strengths of their leadership skills and what areas might require some further development. And then together, they would look to design or to identify really specific opportunities, like on-the-job, real-life assignments, where they could develop that particular leadership skill. So, for example, if you had an athlete leader who was very uncomfortable with public speaking or presenting back to the group, they would then design opportunities, starting with sort of smaller, not so confronting opportunities and building up from there. It might be having to have a difficult conversation and provide some uncomfortable feedback to someone. So the facilitator or a member of the coaching staff would sit down with that athlete leader and they would together sort of plan that conversation and potentially role play the conversation and scaffold that opportunity. And then the athlete leader would have the conversation, and then there would be a debrief of that afterwards. So it was the experiential learning, but in very much a guided and facilitated way that both the athlete leaders themselves and the coaches believed led to the most impactful learning. That they certainly also learned from that sort of social learning, observing other leaders and interacting with other leaders. And sometimes that might be just literally watching another athlete leader or watching a coach. Sometimes that was through more, again, deliberate and intentional activities. They might do a sort of on-site visit to another coach in another team and get a chance to have a sit down with that coach and talk about leadership and hear about their experiences and have an opportunity to ask questions. Certainly the players felt that those informal opportunities were really valuable, possibly more valuable than sort of a formal presentation. So if they had guest speakers come in, it was critical that the guest speaker was really credible. They needed to have a genuine understanding of a high performance environment. So the players really related when the individual that was sharing leadership stories with them had a background in a genuine sort of high pressure, high performance environment. And that might be sport, but at times it was the military and other areas where they could really sort of relate to that sort of pressurized kind of environment. And again, it was the opportunity at the end of those sessions for sort of the informal questions where they didn't feel intimidated or uncomfortable, and they were able to really start to sort of unpack the learning from those things. Most programs also had sort of an element of mentoring as well. And, the athlete leaders found that the mentoring could be really valuable. But the key was finding the right mentor. So they needed to be a really good fit in terms of the personality and the trust with that individual athlete leader and the mentor. And at times the mentors tended to sort of be fans more than a genuinely engaged as a mentor. So that process again required quite a lot of thought and doing the homework and making sure that there was a good appointment and a good match, rather than just ticking a box that each athlete leader had a mentor.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if you've covered this in your last answer. Is informal leadership training as productive as formal leadership training? So is one form better than the other to learn or?
I think so. In the context that we've examined, I think it was definitely a combination of the two. So the informal learning was really valuable when it was combined with that scaffolding and that opportunity for sort of debriefing and one-on-one coaching. So there needed to be that support around the informal learning, to really draw out the learning from the informal experiences. Where the formal learning was beneficial, and this was something that was unanimous amongst the athlete leaders, certainly in our research, was in helping them to actually understand what leadership was. And that might sound a little odd, but most of them came to their leadership role with quite a narrow view, and they acknowledged this, of what leadership looked like. And sometimes that was informed by, having been in that professional football environment. They tended to view leadership as often a sort of command and direct, sort of, more towards the autocratic end of the spectrum. And they didn't always understand how important that relational element is in that influence process. So learning about leadership and learning about the role of empathy and understanding the perspective of others was something that they found very powerful. And also learning about different leadership styles. They often thought that they needed to behave in a certain way to be a leader, that there was only one way to lead, and that was the way that they may have seen, previous coaches lead. So they said that doing that sort of initial formal leadership training to come to understand that there was a range of leadership styles, and that individuals within the team would also have a diverse range of leadership preferences. So different players would respond to different leadership styles. That was very powerful. That gave those athlete leaders confidence, because they came to realize that they didn't need to change who they were in order to lead, that they could lead authentically, in their own leadership style. And they also learned that they could sort of adapt elements of their leadership to resonate with individual players. And as they built those sort of interpersonal skills and those relational skills, they acknowledged that they started to lead with a lot more empathy. So rather than just sort of necessarily giving someone a blast that, maybe wasn't demonstrating a behavior that was aligned with a team value, they would approach that more from a relational sort of empathetic approach, and be checking in with that person, just to see, is everything okay? What's sort of going on that's leading to this? And so we saw a real shift, I suppose, in their understanding of leadership. And they, the players on the whole, said that they found their leadership was so much more powerful when they came to realize that you really couldn't lead effectively with your teammates until you developed the relationships first, and until your teammates knew that you actually, cared about them as people. Then you could actually have some real influence.
In terms of the practical implications, we've talked a little bit about some of them, the having an authentic leadership group and maintaining that authenticity throughout the season. Are there any other practical implications developing leadership groups that I haven't, or that we haven't discussed?
Look, I think we've probably touched on most of them there. I guess just to summarise, it's probably making sure that you're willing to, really commit the time and the human resources to do the work, to make it work. Prioritise that leadership development and that ongoing support. We're still hearing, from a lot of athlete leaders that they're getting sort of appointed to leadership roles without any intentional or deliberate leadership training. And most of them indicate, they really have no clue what they're doing when they're first appointed to that role. And that's still occurring even at an elite level. So I think that's concerning, that we need to make sure we do prioritise the support for them there. Making sure you've got those team values and that cultural piece in place and embedded, and constantly and consistently referencing those values. As you said before, it can't be just a token plastered up on the wall. It does need to be sort of, lived every single day. And when it comes to selecting those players, if you are going to go down the path of that team vote, make sure that the homework is done, the preparation is in place, and that it's carefully managed, and let the players have the time to get to know one another, to really maybe understand who in the group does best represent those values before they do undertake that vote. Have the really clear roles and role clarity in place from the beginning. And just be mindful of sort of managing their load as well. So that certainly we're seeing that athlete leaders, the expectations on them have grown enormously, and the type of support that they're now expected to provide, off the field as well as on, it's quite extensive in some instances. So it's just making sure we are mindful of how much responsibility is it appropriate for their level of skill and their capacity, but also their workload as well.
Thanks, Gina. Just quickly to finish up, for any coaches who may be interested, are you available for any consultancy or facilitation around athlete leadership?
Yeah, absolutely, James. I'm always, really excited to have an opportunity to help teams sort of realise the potency of these leadership groups and maybe have a better opportunity to leverage them and achieve some of the benefits. So I'm always open to that consulting work. So just reach out if anyone is interested, or if anyone has additional questions around that leadership group model, just let me know.
For anyone who'd like to contact Gina for more information around athlete leadership facilitation, you can contact her through LinkedIn under the name Gina Haddad. Alternatively, get in contact with me through the show and I can introduce you to Gina.
Absolutely, that'd be great. Thanks, James. Thanks for having me on.
No, thanks so much. Much appreciated. I hope you've enjoyed this chat with Gina today. The main takeaways from this discussion for me were that setting up a leadership group needs to be authentic. Doing it for the sake of it, because that's what the professional teams do, won't cut the mustard. Leaders need to be given a voice and be heard. Leadership groups need to be diverse and cover a good cross-section of the team so that everyone feels represented and included. Leadership requires time and should be prioritised, and for athletes who have had little or no leadership training, providing some support around their roles and how leadership looks will assist them on becoming better leaders in the future. Finally, embed and consistently reference team values and have these driven by the leadership group. And do your homework around how you will select the leadership group and what their expectations and responsibilities will be. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Coach Doctor Podcast.